commemorative property has been placed. This bill does allow authorized sale of property through the California Cemetery and Funeral Bureau. The bill will make the offense a misdemeanor. Now, additionally, metal theft has become increasingly common as prices for metals have risen dramatically. Commonly stolen metals include copper, aluminum, brass, and different memorabilia that many of these materials are used to make. If you notice some of the VFW, the American Legion, some of these things that are routinely placed even right now on grave sites, some of these go back hundreds of years. The reason for the 50-year limit, we actually talked about this in committee. You know, I was actually going to remove the 50-year limit and make it applicable to the Vietnam era, to Afghanistan. The problem is the price. You know, we don't anticipate there's going to be a camera or what have you in a cemetery or what have you. But in appropriations, you have to look at how much this might cost. Hopefully, when the data comes in, if this bill passes, we will have definitive data and we can expand that so it includes all of this. Right now, as I said, part of this, the reason for this bill is because of some of the shows that you might have seen on TV. It's called American Pickers. It's pawn this and pawn, a different type of pawn. I don't want that to get mixed up with anyway. We're talking about pawn shops and other markets, and it's very, very sad when somebody that has fought for our country and their cemetery site is disturbed just so somebody can grab a grave site or a marker and make money off of it. I ask for your aye vote on this bill.
Mr. Berryhill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I rise in support of this bill. We did talk with Assemblymember Cook in committee about all veterans from Vietnam era as well, and appreciate the author looking into that. And the fact is, it does cost more money, and so this is a step in the right direction to stop the insidious act of stealing war memorabilia off these medals and so forth off of gravestones. So I strongly support this urgent aye vote.
Seeing no further questions or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 68, no 0. Measure passes. Okay, members, we've got about 5 more bills and 2 bills on call and 1 adjourned in memory to go. File item 23, pass and retain. File item 24, ACR 86. Clerk will read.
Assembly concurrent resolution 86 by Assemblymember Hueso and relative to hate crimes.
Mr. Hueso.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. ACR 86 called for February 2012 to be recognized as California No Place for Hate Month. Despite tremendous strides in civil rights over the past few decades, discrimination, specifically manifested through hate crimes, still runs rampant in our society and our state today. California can and should be a leader in finally eliminating this type of discrimination. In addition to recognizing February as No Place for Hate Month, this resolution urges that the issue of hate crimes and the methods of preventing them be discussed with appropriate activities in California schools. ACR 86 also encourages California citizens and families to take it upon themselves to adopt a culture of tolerance, to accept diversity, and to embrace each other as individuals in their daily lives. By raising awareness of this issue and educating Californians, we can further a dialogue and enforce basic human and civil rights. This resolution is sponsored by the Anti-Defamation League and has no opposition. I respectfully request your aye vote and ask for the first roll to be open to co-authors.
Okay, Mr. Hueso is asking for the first roll to be open for co-authors. Since there's no further questions or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. This is for co-authors, members. Co-authors. For the record, there are 54 co-authors. And if we could take a voice vote on this item, all those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The measure is adopted. Okay, we're going to go back to the top of the Assembly third reading file. File item 5, AB 625. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 625 by Assemblymember Amiano, an act relating to sex offender registration.
Mr. Amiano.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker and members. California is one of the few states that require universal lifetime registration for sex offenders with no discernment for the type of offense. While this allows the public to see a majority of offenders and may provide some sense of security, the absence of risk assessment makes this false. The one-size-fits-all registration system makes it difficult to concentrate scarce resources on those who are at higher risk of committing another sex crime, jeopardizing true safety through inadequate and inefficient enforcement and supervision. AB 625 provides the ability to differentiate between sex offenders to focus on monitoring violent and high-risk offenders, and recent floor amendments guarantee that no sex offender will fall off the radar. Let me restate that. No sex offender will ever be removed from the registry. AB 625 creates 3 primary tiers of registration: lifetime, 20 years, and 10 years. And now, after the 10 or 20-year terms are complete and the offender meets all requirements and obligations, they will be placed in a 4th, inactive tier and still required to register but considered a lower risk. Placement is currently determined by only a static risk assessment, the crime of conviction. And AB 625 would add both dynamic and violence risk assessment that are evidence-based and selected by a group of state law enforcement experts, giving law enforcement much better information on offenders. At their own letter states, the tool is not, there has been a tool suggested rather than a dynamic one. But again, it's a static tool, and it's not used on sex offenders under this measure, so opposition based on this is misplaced. The dynamic and violence risk assessments that are part of this new system are evidence-based and were selected by a state panel of law enforcement. Dynamic and violence risk assessments also guarantee that violent offenders don't go into Tier 1, as the opposition mentions. This bill has a number of safeguards which are very strict and very compliant, and is based on recommendations from the State Sex Offender Management Board, which is comprised of experts throughout the state. Mr. Calderon, please. Which is comprised of experts throughout the state who want to make this program workable and manageable through evidence-based practices and research. Being frank, many of you know that in the Assembly Public Safety Committee we have very serious concerns about this issue, and my concerns stem from the current system, where the fact that not all people who are required to register under the current system are the monsters that we read about. There are very bad people out there who require increased supervision, but under the current system it is nearly impossible for people with knowledge of the criminal justice system, let alone the average constituent, to discern. This measure will ensure that the difference is considered through risk assessment, would also make more comfortable when you're considering program expansions for higher risk offenders. AB 625 is not a soft on crime bill or a soft on sex offenders. In fact, it is about increasing management and supervision of violent and high risk offenders, and recognizing that a cookie cutter approach to managing a program with 90,000 registrants and 58 or more different county implementation methods render the system inefficient, ineffective, and unconstitutional. So it is time that we fix this program to work with the interest and work in the interest of real public safety. And I would really urge your aye vote on this. That was so distracting.
Thank you, Mr. Amiano. Mr. Nielsen.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the Assembly, a dangerous bill relating to dangerous people. The least likely of all criminal offenders to rehabilitate is this population. There may be difficulties with a cookie cutter approach, but this inculcates a check-the-box approach. Boxes conceived by ivory tower intellectuals
some of whom intellectualize all public safety concerns and behaviors related to criminality, some of which are responsible for this public safety disaster called realignment we're in the throes of right now. All these assessment tools are now being used, replacing the subjective judgment of people who have been law enforcement professionals for their lives and dedicated and seen the blood on the street. There's flaws even in these risk assessment documents. For example, the Static 99, the Static Sex Offenders Risk Assessment Tool, gives a point if you are under 24 years old and 0 points over 25, meaning someone under 25 is looked at as a higher risk. Now, younger folks generally are more dangerous. However, most sex offenders have not begun their careers and become ingrained in their behavior at that age. My point about this risk assessment tool that now will be incorporated, it's just another dangerous addition. And why are we even considering it? They have a sentence. They must abide by that sentence. It's again similar to the 3 strikes now. This is the time to be kind to criminals, ladies and gentlemen. And if there's any kind of criminal that do not deserve our kindness and whose children do not deserve to be put at risk at their hands, it is of sex offenders. I urge a no vote.
Mr. Hagman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I also rise to oppose this bill. One of the arguments is there's a false premise that California has too many individuals registered as sex offenders. So I want to share some facts. According to the 2008 census statistics, California had the largest population in the Union, 36.5 million residents equaling 12% of the total U.S. population. Out of the 600,000 total number of registered sex offenders nationally, 66,000 were in California sex offender registry that same year. That's about 11% of the total registered sex offenders nationally. This is slightly less than California's share of the U.S. total population. Members, sex offenders registration is merely about providing information to law enforcement and to the public so we can keep an eye on our neighborhoods to make sure our children are safe. It does not make any sense to take this information away on possible suspects. Instead of making false claims, we should be focused on ways to enhance our registry in order to give law enforcement the most current and accurate information possible. This is a bad bill, and the recent amendment takes by the author does nothing to strengthen public safety provisions or make it any more palatable. I urge a no vote.
Mr. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I am not going to belabor the policy issues. I just want to point out a couple of drafting problems in this bill that I think are going to get courts either confused or giving us inconsistent decisions or otherwise just provide a playground for lawyers. And we can fix them. Don't need to support this bill. We can fix these problems and fix the confusion that inevitably results. First of all, the bill says that a person is a Tier 4 offender, quote, if he or she is required to register under the Act, but does not otherwise meet the definitions of Tiers 1, 2, and 3. Those offenders are only required to register during their lifetime, only when that person changes, quote, address. There is a conflict in the definition of Tier 1 and Tier 2 offenders. Current law says Tier 1 and Tier 2 offenders are, quote, subject to registration requirements for a period of, and then it's 10 or 20 years respectively. Well, a person who's registered for 10 or 20 years doesn't meet the definition of a Tier 4 offender. And remember the definition of Tier 4 offenders. A court's likely to find that under this confusing set of circumstances, there may be an offender who doesn't meet the definition of Tier 4 because they're not required, quote, to register under the Act. And we've just said they're not required to register under Tier 1, 2, or 3. People will fall through the cracks, or their lawyers will argue that they fall through the cracks. And it doesn't need to be defined so inconsistently or confusingly. Second of all, there's a loophole within the bill discussing the registered offender's, quote, address. AB 625 requires a Tier 4 offender to register when there is a, quote, change of address. But under the current law, the phrase isn't change of address, it's change of residence. The two are not identical in the law. We can fix that. We just aren't doing it with this bill, and that's a loophole. There could be offenders with multiple residences, can live in either one of them, and plausibly argue, hey, I don't have a duty to re-register. That's not my address. Regardless of the underlying policy, the bill is poorly drafted, sloppily drafted, changes terms, provides a lawyer's, well, delight, and potentially a victim's nightmare. Stop the bill now, fix these problems, can vote accordingly on policy, but just in terms of drafting, this one isn't fully cooked. I urge a no vote.
Mr. Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Here we go. We've got another bill that talks about weakening crime, in my opinion. I want to talk about a couple different issues of this bill. One of them is an issue that comes up quite often, and it's called the Romeo issue, where you don't have that 10-year gap between the people involved. So I'm going to take that to this bill of, say, a 24-year-old and a 14-year-old. Now, under this bill, if a 24-year-old molests that 14-year-old, they can be eligible for that Tier 1. Now, that Tier 1 will allow them to fall off after 10 years and go to this inactive Tier 4 that is very difficult to understand, this Tier 4, and move on when they're 34 years old. Now, statistics would show that a 34-year-old who has been engaged in molesting children or that type of activity at 34 years old does not finish their activity. They're still very active in that role. And so putting them on this inactive Tier 4 list would be a disservice and put one of these people out in our community. Now, one of the parts of this bill says and talks about too many sex offenders. The problem with sex offenders is a lot of people do not report their activity. That's really the problem with the crime here. Many people do not report this activity. If you're involved in molesting kids, they typically will tell the kids to be quiet and not tell authorities, and we've seen that before. That happens. And kids are scared, and they don't do it. So I think that too many sex offenders on this registration is also a disservice. What really happens is a lot of people do not report. This bill is going down a road that's talking about different tiers and different sexual registration, which is a discussion we can have. We absolutely can have that. This bill does not go in the right direction. I ask for a no vote.
Mr. Norby.
I do want to applaud the author for bringing up this subject. I may not be prepared to vote for the bill here, but most of the speakers, even those in opposition, Mr. Speaker, agree that we have to focus this registry and this law on the true threats to our children, rather than a wide net which doesn't really educate but just sensationalizes. I have children at home. I have a 13-year-old junior high school daughter who walks about a half mile to and from school through some of the same neighborhoods I walk to and from school, and I am concerned about her. But as a parent, we all want information we can use. And if a registry tells me that 2 blocks away there was someone who was arrested 5 years ago for public urination in a park because the restroom was closed and there was a bush nearby, that doesn't really help me. Or if somebody 10 years ago streaked down Fraternity Row because he had too much to drink and was cited for that reason, that doesn't really help me either protect my kids. So I think if we're not going to vote for this bill, or if we're going to vote against it, let's at least have the courage to come up with something that can give parents and the public useful information rather than a broad net which too many people get caught up in. There was a case of a 22-year-old Marine stationed in Camp Pendleton, just a few months away from deployment. He met and fell in love with a local junior college student. She was 17. There was a 5-year age difference. The father reported him to the district attorney. He came that close to becoming a permanent sex registrant the rest of his life until his folks who are back in Ohio were able to dig into their life savings and hire an expensive enough law firm to make a deal with a DA to let that 22-year-old Marine off. But there are other people that have been caught up in that, and I don't think that is helpful to us or helpful to them. We have to look just beyond the next hit piece against us for voting for or against any particular bill and really address this law and try to improve it in the future. And hopefully if it does go down, we can do that. So it is a worthwhile topic. I'm glad the authors brought it up, and hopefully those of us that might not be prepared to support it today can look at further refining this so it does accomplish what the public wants it to.
Seeing no further questions or debate, Mr. Amiano, you may close.
Yes, thank you. We've had some very pithy debates today, and I did expect that the same would be with this bill. This is good public policy. There are times when the subject is politically radioactive. There are times when things get unfamiliar and uncomfortable to us, and the pathology of the resistance is always fascinating because it always results in some kind of scare tactics or overstatement or implication that those monsters I refer to will be treated differently now if this bill passed. And it's not the case. And one of the reasons people fall between the cracks is because this system is flawed. I ask you, in the interest of real public safety, for an aye vote. Thank you very much.
Clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. 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 Clerk will close the roll, tally the vote. Ayes 19, noes 41. The measure fails. File item 6, pass and retain. File item 7, AB 1276. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 1276 by Assembly Member Fuhr, an act relating to taxation to take effect immediately. Tax levy.
Mr. Fuhr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. These days, at every level of government, taxes are a hot issue. And they've become a very starkly partisan issue. But this bill should be supported on a bipartisan basis. Because this bill says that conduct that in the legal definition is despicable, malicious, fraudulent, or oppressive shouldn't be deductible as an ordinary business expense. Now, tax law encourages our businesses to engage in productive behavior, to hire people, to invest in capital, and so on. And it encourages that by allowing ordinary business expenses like those to be deducted. But the law draws some stark lines. For example, if a business is fined for a violation of law and pays that fine to the government, that is specifically disallowed as an ordinary business expense that can be deducted. Punitive damages, the damages at stake in this bill, are much like those fines. We should put the same prohibition that we attach to fines on deducting for punitive damages. Now, let's talk about how punitive damages come to be in the first place. Some conduct that is merely negligent, that's an accident, that's a mistake, cannot give rise to punitive damages. Only conduct that has been proven to be intentional gives rise to punitive damages. 95 to 98% of the cases that are filed in our courts never go to trial. Of those that do, about 5% of that small number result in some punitive damages. Why such a small percentage? Because a jury first, in the first phase of the trial, has to find that intentional conduct to which I referred. And then a jury has to engage in a second phase. And in that second phase, the standard is much higher. A jury has to find, not by merely a preponderance of evidence, but clear and convincing evidence, evidence just short of beyond a reasonable doubt, that the conduct was, as I said, malicious, fraudulent, or oppressive. And even after juries find that, many times courts, judges, overturn those decisions. I have examples of a number of times when courts have intervened to say, jury, you're out of line. Because, in fact, the rules that govern when punitive damages are available and for how much have gotten increasingly strict over the years. Yet, for all this, we still allow businesses to deduct this malicious behavior from their tax returns. It's interesting that it is illegal in California for an insurance company to provide insurance that covers punitive damages. So what do we have now? You can't get insurance for this conduct. It's too far out of bounds. And by the way, the playing field for responsible businesses under current law is not fair. Why is it fair for a responsible business or any of our individual constituents to subsidize the behavior through those tax deductions of a business that engages in this reprehensible conduct? It's not fair. And that's why I think this may be the only tax-related bill I have ever seen in this, my last year in the Assembly, that has no opposition. No opposition from the Harvard-Jarvis organization, none from Caltax, none from the Chamber of Commerce, no opposition. Because I think that there is a feeling among those organizations and others that responsible businesses shouldn't continue to be placed at an unfair competitive disadvantage with regard to those businesses that engage in malicious misconduct. Imagine going to a Chamber of Commerce meeting in any of our districts and explaining to those responsible businesses why any of us would oppose a bill that says preserve your legitimate tax deductions, but by the way, allow malicious misbehavior by your competitors to be deductible.
30 seconds.
Pretty hard to explain. This bill should have bipartisan support as we send a message to the very taxpayers, business individuals throughout our districts that in this time of shared sacrifice, we get it. Our tax laws should be fair. I urge an aye vote.
Mr. Donnelly.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, members. You know, I had lunch on Friday with a manufacturer, a guy that I did business with for almost 20 years. And I asked him, I said, you know, if there's one thing you could do in the state of California, if there was one idea that we could turn into a bill or a repeal of a law, what would it be? And he said tort reform. He said loser pays. He said get these malicious attorneys that are predators. They come after us. I've spent $400,000 in legal fees to keep them at bay, and I've done nothing wrong except try to create jobs here in the state of California. So until we've dealt with that problem, I think this business of making such a big case out of punitive damages. We all have heard the cases against McDonald's and Dow Chemical, and there was no scientific evidence. There were huge verdicts, massive verdicts, business-crushing verdicts, and yet no real guilt. Nothing wrong. And so I would urge you to also consider one other factor. It says that this has been amended, and yet there's no evidence of any amendments since the last time we voted on this. And I think that that issue needs to be addressed. Otherwise, I don't think you're going to see any additional support. I urge a no vote.
Mr. Wagner?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And we did consider this in detail last session, and the bill is still imperfect and deserves a no vote. I think that my colleague Mr. Donnelly just touched on the overarching concern, which is with the punitive damages system. There were bills last year that sought some reform of the punitive damages system. Those died. I think that, at least on my side of the aisle, we would be very receptive to working collaboratively and bipartisanly to fix the punitive damages system that is, in fact, running amok in this state. The fix here, though, is, number one, not directed at the real problem, and number two, is not a fix. And let me explain why. It is, we hear hard to go back to our districts and explain this. Well, actually, no, it's not. This is not our policy alone. We are not the ones that are out of step. We are not the ones with some bizarre, inexplicable provision of tax code. We are following the law that is the majority in the rest of the country, and indeed is federal tax law. If we adopt this measure, we run the risk of throwing our businesses and their tax issues completely out of compliance with the feds. You're a business in California. This law comes down. Now you're suddenly confronted with a mismatched tax system, state and federal. Get out of California. Just get out of California and go somewhere where the law is consistent. That's not what we want to be doing. We want to be fixing the law. We want to be fixing the tort system. We want to rein in punitive damages where they are inappropriate. But we don't want to put us out of step with so many other states and out of step with so much federal tax law. That's good law. There's a reason the tax code has grown the way it has. Don't take my word for it. I don't often do this on this floor, but the Los Angeles Times editorialized against this bill the last time it came up. The Los Angeles Times editorialized that there are sound fiscal reasons for this tax policy. We haven't had a chance to debate them. We don't understand necessarily what they are. We run the risk of throwing ourselves in complete disarray and at least causing our businesses with their tax compliance issues to be in complete disarray. Let's not do it. Let's say no this time and fix some of the underlying problems.
Dr. Halderman?
Question of the author.
Without objection.
Would you please repeat whether or not there's registered opposition?
There is no registered opposition to the bill.
In the analysis by our consultants, the California Taxpayers Association is in opposition to this bill.
I have seen no registered opposition to the bill.
Thank you.
Seeing no further questions or debate, Mr. Fuhrer, you may close.
Thank you. For the first time, I'm going to ask Madam Speaker for permission to read.
Without objection.
I want to read from the Los Angeles Times editorial that was just erroneously referred to. Here's what the Times said in an editorial entitled, "Keeping Punitive Damages Punitive." Companies that pay, this is the subhead, punitive damages, can deduct those payments from their state and federal tax returns. That's wrong and counterproductive. A bill in Sacramento would correct it. The conclusion of the Times editorial endorsing the bill says this bill requires at least some measure of bipartisanship because it affects revenue, and this requires a 2/3 vote. And then it concludes by saying this would correct an obvious wrong. The Times last year made the case for the bill in very forceful language. I omitted reading the balance of the editorial, but you can get the point. And here's why it took that stance. Look at Washington. It is true that at the moment, federal law still permits punitive damages to be deductible. But it's also the case that, among others, one of the key Republican leaders, Judd Gregg, when he was focused on this issue, called this one of the most outrageous elements of American tax law. Why? For the reasons I stated before, because of the unevenness of the playing field that the status quo allows. And make no mistake, if you oppose the bill today, you are perpetuating a system under which responsible businesses subsidize not a mistake by a colleague, not some error that was negligent, but subsidize in the words of the law again, despicable, malicious, oppressive, or fraudulent misconduct. And we're going to stand with those people? Do you think that any legitimate business in any of our districts contemplates leaving California because they anticipate that they will be found to have engaged in despicable, malicious misconduct? No way. And as to the point that this would create a difference between federal and state law, yes, on this one point, if this law were to pass, a business that is found to engage in this reprehensible misconduct could continue for the moment to deduct from its federal returns the expenses, but not from its state returns. I think the accountants for those businesses could handle that minor discrepancy. What none of us should abide, however, is continuing to view this issue through such a starkly partisan lens that we perpetuate unfairness that none of us should abide in our tax code. Urge an aye vote.
Seeing no further questions or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. This requires 54 votes. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Mr. Fior moves the call. Okay, we're going to go down to the Senate third reading. File item 26, SB 9. Oh, I'm sorry. File item 25 and 26 pass and retain. File item 27, SB 880. Clerk will read.
Senate Bill 880 by Senator Corbett and others, an act relating to common interest development and declaring an urgency thereof to take effect immediately.
Ms. Butler.
Madam Speaker and members, Senate Bill 880 clarifies existing law established by Senate Bill 2009, authored by Senator Corbett last year. While the governor was supportive of the policy in SB 209, he indicated a desire that legislation be introduced to clearly protect the right of common interest developments to establish reasonable rules for any use of common areas for charging stations. SB 880 does just that by addressing the governor's signing message and restricts an owner's ability to install a charging station in the common area without an agreement from the association. SB 880 has no opposition, has bipartisan support, as well as the support of electric vehicle advocates, homeowners associations, and home insurance companies. In an effort to encourage electric vehicle use, I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Seeing no further questions or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. This requires 54. It's an urgency. All members vote who desire to vote. 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 Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 54, noes 15 on the urgency. Ayes 54, noes 15 on the measure. Measure passes. And the last bill is file item 2 on the concurrence file, AB 1413. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 1413 by Assemblymember Fong, an act relating to elections and declaring an urgency thereof to take effect immediately.
Mr. Fong.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. AB 1413 is back for concurrence and Senate amendments. In 2009, as part of the budget deal, a measure was placed on the ballot for the voters to consider authorizing a top 2 primary election system. At the same time that measure was approved, the legislature also approved a series of changes to the elections code to implement the top 2 system. Unfortunately, those changes created a number of problems for the effective and efficient operation of elections. Among other problems, county election officials identified certain ballot printing requirements that create an unnecessary burden and could significantly increase local election costs. And the Los Angeles County Register of Voters has indicated that the county's voting system is unable to accommodate the existing requirements for conducting the primary election under the top 2 primary system. AB 1413 makes numerous technical and substantive changes to the Elections Code to provide for more effective and efficient implementation of California's top two primary election system. AB 1413 is supported by the Secretary of State, county election officials, and by proponents of the top two system. It received unanimous support in the Senate and in the Elections and Redistricting Committee. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Ms. Brownlee?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think a question to the author, and I understand what you're trying to do, and it's necessary to do because there's a lot of cleanup that has to happen here. I think my concern around SB 6 when that was in front of us is about this issue of write-in votes. And I don't think in Prop 14 it was ever the intent in Prop 14 to eliminate the ability of voters to write in a candidate, to vote for a write-in candidate, and for that vote to be counted. So that continues to be my concern, and I guess my question to you is there any way in which we could fix that?
Well, SB 6, the implementing bill for the top two primary system, got rid of write-ins in the general election for certain elections, and it was SB 6 that got it. And after SB 6 passed, voters filed a lawsuit against the Secretary of State, arguing that it was confusing for write-in lines to be printed on the ballot if write-in votes weren't going to be counted. So the California Appellate Court agreed that it was confusing, and the court then ordered that write-in spaces not be printed on general election ballots. As a result, the status quo is that write-in votes won't be counted and that write-in lines won't appear on the ballot. AB 14 simply conforms the statute to the court's ruling. There are some groups and individuals that would like us to reinstate the ability of candidates to run as write-ins in the general election. That is a legitimate policy debate to have. And as the chair of the Elections and Redistricting Committee, I will be leading in that policy debate because I do like write-in votes as well. But I welcome you to join in that debate.
Thank you, Mr. Fong.
Seeing no further questions or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 69, no 0, measure passes. On the urgency, ayes 69, no 0 on the measure, measure passes. Okay, we've got 3 items on call. We're going to take them in order on the computer. First item on call, file item 12, AB 327. Clerk will post. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Mr. Davis moves the call. Next item, file item 4, AB 1208. Clerk will post. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 41, noes 23. Measure passes. File item 7, AB 12, AB 1276. Clerk will post. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 49, noes 25. Measure fails. Okay, we're going to lift the call again on file item 12, AB 327. Clerk will post. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 36, noes 34. Measure fails. Mr. Davis asks for reconsideration. Notices reconsideration. Mr. Hagman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We do oppose the reconsideration. I ask for a roll call vote on it.
Mr. Hagman, you can't oppose the reconsideration.
Okay. Madam Speaker, they'd like to make motion to waive the one-day notice and ask for immediate reconsideration.
Mr. Hagman, you need a second on this motion? Mr. Garrick seconds. This takes 41 votes. Mr. Calderon opposes this. Okay, Mr. Hagman moved to waive the one-day notice for reconsideration, seconded by Mr. Garrick. Mr. Calderon opposes the motion. We're going to open the roll. Mr. Hagman asks for an aye vote. Mr. Calderon asks for a no vote. Takes 41 votes. Clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 27, noes 44. Motion fails. Mr. Davis's motion will be up tomorrow. Okay, we're at the consent calendar. Second day consent calendar. Does any member wish to remove an item from the second day consent calendar? Seeing and hearing none, clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 1431 by the Assembly Committee on Accountability and Administrative Review and Act relating to government reports.
All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 68, no 0. The consent calendar is adopted. This concludes the business on the daily file. We will now move to announcements and adjourn in memories. Announcements. Tomorrow, January 31st, is the last day for the Assembly to pass Assembly bills introduced in 2001. The session schedule is as follows. Tuesday, January 31st, floor session at 9 a.m. Wednesday, February 1st, check-in session. Thursday, February 2nd, floor session at 9 a.m. Friday, February 3rd, no floor session, no check-in. All other items remaining will be passed and retained. All motions shall be continued. We've got one adjourn in memory and one or two announcements. Mr. Furutani. Mr. Furutani.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Members, I know it's been a long day, but we do things on the floor that we sometimes maybe forget about. Last session, we passed what was called Fred Korematsu Day for Civil Liberties and the Constitution. A few weeks ago, we had an adjourn in memory of Gordon Hirabayashi. Mr. Hirabayashi and Mr. Korematsu were two of four Japanese Americans who challenged the constitutional decision that it was right to put Japanese Americans in camp during World War II. Fred Korematsu, many years later, through a quorum nobis process, challenged that decision by the Supreme Court, succeeded, they vacated the decision, and it became an issue studied in law school throughout the country and throughout the world. We voted on Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution to acknowledge this very special day, January 30th, the one and only day that acknowledges specifically an Asian Pacific Islander American for a day like this in California. So as we had lengthy debate and the lawyers ruled the day and ruled the floor today, the discussion about Fred Korematsu is one of those issues that you study along with integration and several others in law school because it's clearly a constitutional issue that has changed the course of American history. So let's not forget what we did last session in establishing Fred Korematsu Day for Civil Liberties and the Constitution on January 30th. Thank you.
Okay, and Mr. Fong asks for immediate transmittal to the Senate for immediate transmittal to the Governor's office. AB 1413, file item 2, AB 1413, immediate transmittal to the Governor's office.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and our adjourn in memory, Mr. Cedillo.
Members, please, if you will indulge me, I know it's been a very long and rigorous afternoon, but I want to talk about a great life of a great environmentalist, an urban trailblazer, Francis Scott Wilson. Francis Scott Wilson was born in Salem, Oregon on May 3rd, 1922. I think what's important about the substance of his great life is that he spent 30 years as a teacher at Eagle Rock, Crenshaw, and North Hollywood High Schools, teaching horticulture, floriculture, and animal husbandry, environmental science, and forestry. What's important about that, members, is you have to understand, in the LA urban environment, these are unknown. One thing I discovered when I became a legislator is that California is a very rich, natural environment. It's rural. It has great forests. It has a lot of stuff to excite environmentalists. But when you grow up in Los Angeles or San Francisco, you don't think about these things, unless you're very fortunate to have an inspiring teacher like Francis Scott Wilson. And so I think it's important for us to recognize the great life that he had teaching young urban kids about the importance of the environment, his pioneering efforts in urban forestry. He had a master's degree in a license in landscape architecture, had a master's in science and education. He wrote instructional manuals, and he helped create corridors within the city of Los Angeles of trees. And it's just, again, in that environment, I cannot tell you what a great pioneer he was. At the end, he founded what was known as the Northeast Trees in 1989, and his goal was to plant 5 trees a day for the rest of his life and to improve the world for his grandchildren. He and his efforts led to 7,000 trees, creating the greening of Los Angeles. He was a world traveler, and he was also involved in sailing. He was an avid sailor. He raced the Summerwind in the Congressional Cup and in the 1975 Trans-Pac to Hawaii. Unfortunately and sadly, on November 7th, 2011, he passed away surrounded by his family. And his last act was to cut blossoms from the firewheel tree in his garden for the altar in the church. To the very end, he was an urban environmentalist. He leaves behind Clarlie, Ron, Christian, brother Otis, grandchildren Hillary, Haley, Nick, and Katie, son-in-law Paul, daughter-in-law Cindy, a loving extended family, and so many students who learned about the environment beyond the cement floors and ceilings of their world. He taught them that there is a natural environment beyond the borders of the urban environment. For that, we will always be indebted to this man who lived with passion, humor, and determination. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cedillo. Please bring Mr. Wilson's name to the desk to be printed in the journal. Ready to entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Calderon moves and Ms. Conway seconds that this House stands adjourned until Tuesday, January 31st at 9 a.m. Quorum calls lifted. Hold on.